The day Cora Keller rode into Abilene with 800 head of longhorn cattle, and not a single man's name on her contract, the whole town stopped breathing. It was the summer of 1873, and the Kansas plains shimmered with a heat that turned the horizon into liquid silver. Cora was 26 years old, sunburned to the color of saddle leather, her dark hair pinned under a battered hat that had belonged to her father before the fever took him 2 winters past. She sat her horse the way only someone born to the saddle could, straight and certain, with the kind of quiet authority that made men twice her age step back without quite knowing why they had done it. Behind her, 800 longhorns moved in a slow, massive tide of horn and dust and complaint. They had come up from Texas, from the Keller Ranch outside of San Antonio, across 400 miles of river crossings and rattlesnake country and summer storms that turned the creek beds into churning brown walls of water. Cora had led them every mile. Her foreman, a weathered Mexican cowhand named Rodrigo Vasquez, rode up beside her as the herd funneled into the holding pens at the edge of town. He was 50 years old, with a white scar that ran from his left ear to his chin, and he had worked for Cora's father for 20 years before the elder Keller died. "They will not like it," Rodrigo said, tilting his head toward the cluster of men gathered near the stockyard gate. "They will say your father's name should be on the paper." "My father is dead," Cora said, "and I drove the cattle." "Yes," Rodrigo agreed, with a slow nod that held all the weight of a man who had seen the world treat women as invisible for 50 years. "But they will say it anyway." She had heard it before. She had heard it from the bank in San Antonio, where they refused to extend her credit without a male cosigner. She had heard it from the neighboring ranchers who had come to offer her assistance that amounted to them taking over the Keller land. She had heard it from the cattle broker in Fort Worth who had told her flat out that a woman's name on a cattle contract wasn't worth the paper it was printed on north of the Red River. Cora had decided, somewhere around the second river crossing when the water was chest-deep, and the steers were panicking and Rodrigo was yelling in Spanish, and the 2 youngest hands were white-faced with terror, that she was tired of hearing it. The cattle broker she was supposed to meet in Abilene was a man named Gerald Harwick, and she had arranged the deal through a series of letters over the winter, never once specifying that she was the rancher and not a rancher's wife. Not that she had lied precisely. She had simply signed her letters C. Keller, which was the truth, and let Gerald Harwick assume whatever Gerald Harwick chose to assume. But when she rode up to the stockyard office and dismounted and pushed through the door, the man behind the desk was not Gerald Harwick. He was younger than she had expected from any cattle buyer in Abilene, perhaps 30 or 31, with broad shoulders that strained slightly at the seams of a good wool jacket that was clearly not made for a man who spent time outdoors. He had brown hair that needed cutting, the kind that curled slightly at the ends when the heat got to it, and eyes the particular shade of gray-green that reminded Cora of the sky over the Texas hill country just before a thunderstorm rolled in. He was reading through a stack of papers when she entered, and he looked up with an expression of polite professional attention that transformed, in the space of about 2 seconds, into something considerably more complicated. He had clearly been expecting someone else. "Miss," he said, rising from his chair with the automatic courtesy of a man who had been well raised, "can I help you?" "I'm here to settle the contract on the Keller cattle," Cora said. She crossed the room in 3 strides and set her copy of the agreement on the desk between them. 812 head as counted this morning coming into the pens. That's 12 above the contracted number, and I expect fair price per head for the extras." The man stared at the papers. Then he looked at her. Then he looked at the papers again. "You're C. Keller," he said. "Cora Keller." "Yes." A pause opened between them that had weather in it. "Gerald Harwick was my employer," the man said carefully. "He passed away 3 weeks ago. Heart failure. I'm Edwin Bancroft, his junior partner. I've been managing his accounts." "I'm sorry for your loss," Cora said, because she meant it and because it was the right thing to say, but she kept her eyes level and her hands flat on the desk because she also recognized opportunity when it was standing in front of her. This man was new. He didn't have 20 years of cattle brokerage opinions about women ranchers. He might not have any opinions at all yet. "Thank you," Edwin Bancroft said. He was still looking at her with that complicated expression, like a man trying to solve an equation in his head while someone was talking loudly in the next room. "Miss Keller, I have to be direct with you." "I prefer it," she said. The contract was negotiated under the assumption that the ranch was operated by, he paused, choosing words. "By a man," Cora said flatly. "By my father, presumably, since I signed my letters with my initial and men always assume." Something moved in his expression. It wasn't offense, exactly. It looked more like discomfort, the kind that comes from recognizing that you are about to say something you already know is wrong before you say it. "The other buyers in town have an informal agreement," he said slowly. "They don't purchase cattle from operations where he stopped." He picked up her contract and read through it again, though Cora suspected he was not reading so much as thinking. "Where the rancher is a woman," she finished for him. "I know about the agreement. I also know it's not written down anywhere, which means it's not binding on anyone who chooses not to honor it. And I know that the other buyers in this town will be just as interested in 800 head of prime Texas longhorn as you are, and that I could walk across the street and knock on Harlan Cooper's door right now." "Cooper won't buy from you either," Edwin said. "Not if he knows." "Then maybe I don't tell him my name is Cora," she said. "Maybe I walk in there and say I'm C. Keller, same as my letters, and let him assume, same as your late employer did, and we settle before he looks at my face long enough to think about it." Edwin Bancroft set down her contract. He looked at her for a long moment with those stormy gray-green eyes, and Cora looked back with the steady patience of a woman who had just driven 800 cattle 400 miles and was not going to be undone by a man's discomfort. "The cattle are good stock?" he asked at last. "The best you'll see come through Abilene this season," she said. "Mixed breed, mostly longhorn with some of the newer Durham cross for better weight. My father started the breeding program 8 years ago. The herd was his life's work." "How long did the drive take?" 23 days from the ranch. We lost 4 head to a river crossing near Red River Station and 2 more to a snakebite incident near the Cimarron. Everything else is standing in your stockyard pens right now." Edwin Bancroft was quiet for another moment. Outside, she could hear the bawling of cattle and the shouts of the yard hands and the distant sound of a piano from one of the saloons. The afternoon light came through the dusty window at a long angle and caught the dust motes hanging in the air between them like something out of a painting. "The agreement the other buyers have," Edwin said finally. "It isn't law." "No," Cora agreed, "it is not. And Gerald, whatever his personal opinions, was a man who valued a good contract above most things," he continued, more to himself than to her. "He wouldn't have wanted a solid deal to collapse because of," he stopped again. "Because of my gender," Cora said. Edwin looked at her directly then, with a frankness that surprised her. "Because of something that has nothing to do with the quality of the cattle or the integrity of the deal," he said. "That's what I was going to say." She studied him for a moment. He didn't look away. "All right," she said. "Then we agree." He pulled the contract toward him. He uncapped the ink bottle on the desk, dipped the pen, and signed his name in the clean, clear hand of a man who had been educated properly. Edwin Bancroft. The signature sat there on the page next to C. Keller, and something about the sight of it made Cora's throat tighten in a way she had not expected and could not entirely explain. "I'll need to inspect the herd before final settlement," he said, replacing the pen cap. "Of course," she said. "I'll take you through them myself." He looked up from the contract with something that might have been surprise. "You don't need to. I want to," she said. "I know every animal in that herd. I can tell you which ones gave us trouble and which ones led the rest. You'll make better decisions if you know the stock." A slow, genuine smile crossed Edwin Bancroft's face for the first time, and it changed his appearance considerably. It made him look less like a man behind a desk and more like someone who might be interesting to know. "Lead the way, Miss Keller," he said. She did. They walked the pens for the better part of 2 hours in the long Kansas afternoon, and Cora talked about cattle the way other women might talk about family, because to her, they were nearly the same thing. She pointed out the dominant steers and the troublemakers and the ones her father had named, which she had refused to rename because it seemed like a betrayal she wasn't ready for. Edwin listened with the focused attention of a man who was genuinely learning something, asking questions that were good questions, the kind that showed he understood the foundation of what she was telling him even if he didn't know all the specific vocabulary yet. "You know cattle," she said at one point, almost as an accusation. "My family raised Herefords in Ohio," he said. "I came out here 3 years ago when Gerald offered me a partnership. Different business than actually raising them, but the fundamentals translate." "Why did you leave Ohio?" she asked. He was quiet for a beat and she thought she might have overstepped, but then he said, "My father had 4 sons and a farm that could support one. I was the second son. I needed to make something that was mine." Cora understood that so thoroughly it almost hurt. "Yes," she said softly. "So did I." He looked at her then, and it was the first time all afternoon that the look between them had nothing to do with cattle. The sun was getting low and orange by the time they finished the inspection. Rodrigo and the other hands were making camp on the edge of town near the pens, as was customary. Cora needed to settle the animals and check that the injured steer from the last day's drive was being seen to by the local horse doctor who had agreed to look him over. "The cattle are everything you said they were," Edwin told her as they walked back toward the office. "More, actually. The Durham cross percentage is higher than average. Your father knew what he was doing." "He did," Cora agreed. "And so do I." He stopped walking. They were standing in the dusty street in front of the stockyard office, and the evening light was making everything the color of copper and old gold. He looked at her with that complicated expression again, and then something seemed to settle in him, some internal debate that she was not privy to but the conclusion of which was apparently in her favor. "The final settlement," he said. "I'll pay the contracted price per head for the 800 and market rate for the additional 12. Is that agreeable?" "It is," she said. "And I'll need to send a letter back to the company's investors in Kansas City about the contract," he added. "There may be questions. About my name?" "Yes." She held his gaze. "Tell them the cattle are sound, the contract was fairly negotiated, and the drive was completed without incident and on schedule. Tell them whatever you like about who signed it. If the investors object, I imagine you'll be able to point to the healthy profit margin and they'll find a way to be comfortable." Something flickered in his eyes that might have been admiration. "That's a very practical approach." "I'm a very practical woman," she said. "I'm beginning to understand that," Edwin Bancroft said. She nodded to him and walked away toward the pens, and she did not look back, but she was aware of his eyes on her the whole way, warm as the late sun on her shoulders. The business of settling the herd into the pens and arranging feed and water took another 2 hours. Rodrigo supervised the hands with the efficient, quiet authority of a man who had been doing this work his whole life, and Cora worked alongside them, not because she had to, but because she always had. Her father had taught her that the boss who worked was the boss who was respected, and she had never forgotten it. When it was fully dark and the cattle were settled and the hands were eating around the fire Rodrigo had built, Cora washed her face and hands at the pump behind the pens and tried to think clearly about what came next. The drive was done. The contract was signed. She would collect payment tomorrow morning, and she would have enough money to repay the bank loan in San Antonio, enough to buy the breeding stock she had been planning for 2 years, and enough left over to make it through the winter with something resembling security. It was everything she had worked for since the fever had taken her father and left her the Keller ranch, the debts, and the enormous complicated problem of being a woman alone in a world that did not know what to do with her. She should have felt triumphant. She did feel triumphant underneath the exhaustion. But she also kept thinking about Edwin Bancroft's face when she had said, "So do I," about needing to make something that was her own. The way he had looked at her. The way something had understood. She told herself she was tired and that was all. She was not entirely just tired. The next morning she went to the office early before the heat built and found Edwin already there with the settlement paperwork laid out and coffee on the small iron stove in the corner. He poured her a cup without asking if she wanted one, as if he had simply known she would, and she took it and drank it and felt the road weariness ease slightly from her shoulders. The settlement went smoothly. The numbers were correct. He had added a small additional sum for the above-contracted quality of the Durham crosses that she had not expected, and she looked at the figure and then at him. "That's above market rate," she said. "It's accurate market rate for the actual quality of the stock," he replied calmly. "The standard contract price assumes average grade. Yours aren't average grade." She could have argued the point, because she knew perfectly well that most buyers would have paid the contracted rate and pocketed the difference in quality as profit. She did not argue. She signed the receipt and folded the bank draft carefully and put it inside her coat, and it felt like freedom in paper form. "What will you do now?" Edwin asked, and there was something in the question that made her think he was asking something slightly larger than just the immediate logistics. "I'll spend 2 days resting the horses and the men," she said. "Then we'll start back south. There's work waiting on the ranch. My breeding stock needs tending. I have a spring roundup to plan for next year. And another drive. If the cattle are strong enough and the price holds." She tilted her head slightly. "Why?" He was looking at his coffee. "I'll be in Abilene through the end of the season, managing Gerald's accounts. After that, I don't know yet. The company may want me in Kansas City, or I may choose a different path." He looked up. "I was thinking I might ride out to see the herd one more time this afternoon before you start moving them to the rail pens for the loading. I'd like to see them in the open, not just the stock pens." "That sounds like a man who doesn't quite know how to say he'd like company," Cora said. The corner of his mouth turned. "Maybe it does," he admitted. "I'll be at the pens at 2 o'clock, she said. She was there at 2 o'clock and so was he. They rode out east of town, where the holding range was broad and grassy, and the cattle moved in their slow, dignified way under the big Kansas sky. Edwin rode well, she noticed, not with the effortless natural grace of a man who had grown up on a horse's back the way her ranch hands had, but with the competent confidence of someone who had learned properly and practiced with care. His horse was a good one, a steady bay gelding that handled the nearness of the herd without flinching. They rode without talking much for a while, which Cora found unexpectedly comfortable. She had spent 23 days surrounded by men who talked constantly because they were nervous or bored or trying to assert themselves, and the quality of Edwin's silence was different. It was thoughtful. It had room in it. "You have hands who are loyal to you," he said finally, watching Rodrigo in the distance, cutting a stray from the edge of the herd with the precision of a man who had done it 10,000 times. "Rodrigo has been with the Keller ranch longer than I've been alive," she said. "The others are his picks. He knows men. They follow you without question. They follow good sense," she said, "which this season has been represented by me." Edwin laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that came up from the chest, and it surprised her by how much she liked the sound of it. "Your investors in Kansas City," she said. "Did you write to them already?" A brief pause. "I sent a telegram last night." "And?" He turned to look at her, and there was a steadiness in his eyes that she was starting to recognize as characteristic, the way he looked at difficult things directly rather than sideways. "They had questions. About my name. About whether the contract was sound, whether the operation was legitimate, whether the chain of ownership was clear." He held her gaze. "I answered all 3 questions in detail. I told them I had inspected the herd personally and found it above grade. I told them the Keller Ranch had been in operation for 19 years, and the ownership passed by will to the daughter of the founder. I told them the contract had been properly negotiated and fairly executed. And the fact that the person who drove the cattle was a woman. I told them that as well, he said. I told them the drive had been completed in 23 days from San Antonio with less than 1% loss, which is exceptional by any standard, and that the rancher in question had personally overseen every mile of it. I suggested they judge the operation by its results. Cora was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the grass around them and the cattle shifted and the sky was so blue it almost hurt to look at. That was a brave letter to write, she said. It was an honest letter, he replied. I find those are usually the same thing. She looked at him then, really looked at him, past the wool jacket and the professional manner and the careful words, and she saw a man who was trying to be good in a world that often made that difficult. She knew something about that. The investor's response, she asked. They accepted the contract, with a note suggesting that future negotiations should be carefully considered. The faint emphasis he put on those words said everything about what he thought of the note. Thank you, Cora said, and because she did not say those words carelessly, because they were not a woman's polite nothing, he seemed to hear the weight of them. You'd have found another buyer, he said. Probably, she agreed. But I'm glad I found you first. They rode back toward town as the sun began its long descent into the prairie, painting everything in hues of amber and rose. Cora noticed the way the light caught in the gray-green of Edwin's eyes when he turned to say something about the Durham Cross's pasture management. And she noticed, too, that she was noticing, which was something she had not allowed herself to do with anyone in a long time. There was too much riding on this season's work to be distracted by a handsome cattle buyer with an honest disposition. She told herself that firmly and meant it, and also knew, somewhere in the practical part of herself, that meaning it and acting on it were going to be two different things if she spent much more time in Edwin Bancroft's company. That evening, Rodrigo found her by the fire with a look that she recognized as the one he used when he had something to say that he didn't want to say. The men want to celebrate, he said. The drive is done. The contract is settled. They want to find the less disreputable saloon and drink moderately and perhaps dance a little. Tell them they've earned it, Cora said. 2-drink limit. I need everyone upright at dawn. Rodrigo nodded, but he didn't move. That was the look. What else? She said. The buyer, Rodrigo said carefully. Bancroft, he is not what I expected. What did you expect? Problems, Rodrigo said. We always find problems at the end of the drive. This time the problem was supposed to be the buyer. Instead, he shrugged, a very particular shrug that in Rodrigo's language meant I have noticed something I will not name directly. He is the buyer, Cora said. The business is done. We leave in 2 days. Yes, Rodrigo said in the tone of a man who is agreeing to the words but not to the thing beneath the words. Rodrigo. Yes, Miss Keller. Go find the men before they locate the saloon without permission. Of course, he said, and went, and the look he gave her over his shoulder as he went was kind enough to make her look away. She sat by the fire for a long time after, watching the coals breathe. The next morning brought an unexpected complication in the form of a man named Burton Hale, who was one of the other cattle buyers in Abilene, and who had apparently learned overnight that the Keller contract had been signed and settled by Edwin. Burton Hale was 55, thick through the middle, and had the kind of face that had set early into an expression of settled certainty about the rightness of his own opinions. He arrived at the stockyard office while Cora was there finalizing the arrangements for the rail loading, and he had 2 other men with him, including Harlan Cooper, who was the buyer Edwin had mentioned the day before. Bancroft, Burton Hale said, ignoring Cora entirely in the way that men sometimes did, as if not looking at a woman made her cease to exist. I heard you settled the Keller contract yesterday. I did, Edwin said. He was standing behind the desk and he did not sit down, which Cora recognized as the deliberate choice it was. You should have spoken to us first, Hale said. We have an understanding in this town about certain types of business. I'm aware of the understanding, Edwin said. I chose not to participate in it. Gerald Harwick always honored the agreement, Cooper said, from behind Hale's shoulder. Gerald Harwick is dead, Edwin said, with a quiet finality that closed that line of argument. I run this office now, and I make my own agreements based on the quality of the business offered to me. The Keller cattle are excellent stock. The contract was fair. The deal is done." "The deal," Hale said, his voice dropping to something that was not quite a threat but was in the same neighborhood, "can be contested. There are those who'd question the legitimacy of a contract signed by a woman without the agreement of—" "Without the agreement of whom?" Cora said. She had been quiet until now, standing to the side with her arms crossed and her hat pushed back on her head, watching. Now she stepped forward and the word landed in the middle of the room like a dropped stone. All three men looked at her. Hale's face did something complicated. "Miss," he said. "Cora Keller," she said. "The rancher, the person whose name is on the contract. If you have concerns about legitimacy, Mr. Hale, I'd be grateful if you'd address them to me, since I'm the party to the contract and I'm standing right here." "This is not a matter for a woman," she said pleasantly. "And yet here is my name, on a legally executed contract, with a properly licensed cattle broker, in the presence of witnesses, for the sale of 812 head of Texas longhorn at an agreed-upon price that has been settled in full. Which part of that requires a man's name to be legitimate?" Hale opened his mouth and then closed it. Cooper looked at the ceiling. The third man, who had not said anything, seemed to be having private thoughts about being somewhere else. "The understanding we have in this town," Hale said carefully, "is a professional courtesy among businessmen." "Among businessmen," Cora agreed. "I'm a rancher. Mr. Bancroft is a cattle buyer. This is a cattle town. Where does your professional courtesy enter into our transaction?" Edwin, behind the desk, had gone very still in the way of a man who was watching something unfold that he was simultaneously impressed by and ready to defend if it became necessary. "Bancroft," Hale said, redirecting, "you'll find doing business in this town considerably more difficult if you make a habit of buying good cattle at fair prices." Edwin said, "I'll take that risk." The silence that followed was the kind with teeth in it. Then Hale straightened his jacket and looked at Cora with the look of a man filing something away for future grievance. "This isn't finished," he said. "For me it is," Cora replied. "My business in Abilene is complete." When they left, the door clicking shut behind them, the room breathed again. Cora turned to find Edwin watching her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. "You didn't need to do that," he said. "I had it managed." "You did," she agreed, "but it felt good to manage it myself." Something warm moved across his face. "Yes," he said softly, "I imagine it did." The rail loading was scheduled for the following morning, and Cora spent the rest of the day overseeing it with the focused competence that had gotten her this far, making sure the loading crew handled the cattle without undue stress, checking the car capacities and the water provisions, signing the rail company's paperwork and verifying the count. Edwin came by in the afternoon, ostensibly to sign his portion of the shipping documentation, and stayed for 2 hours. He helped with absolutely nothing, technically. He asked questions and listened and occasionally handed Cora a piece of paper she was reaching for, and somehow by the end of it, the afternoon had been both more efficient and more pleasant than it would have been without him. "You're good at this," he said, as the last car was loaded and the doors latched. "I've been ranching my whole life," she said. "I don't mean the cattle," he looked at her steadily. "I mean all of it. The management, the reading of people, the knowing when to speak and when to wait. It's not common." She was hot and dusty, and her back ached from 2 days of loading, and before that 23 days of driving, and the compliment landed differently than she expected, because it was not about her looks or her courage or any of the things men said to women as if they were unusual for possessing basic competence. It was about the actual work. It was about what she had made of herself. "My father taught me," she said. "He believed that the person who would eventually run the ranch should know every part of it." "He was right," Edwin said. "He also believed it would be one of my brothers, but they both died young," Cora said, and her voice was steady because she had made peace with that particular sadness years ago, even if it still had weight. "So it fell to me, and I am glad it did, even though it was not the way any of us planned." Edwin was quiet for a respectful moment. "How long has the ranch been yours alone?" 2 years since my father passed," she said. My mother passed when I was 12. I have a distant cousin in Austin who wrote twice asking if I needed management assistance, and I declined twice and he stopped writing. Good, Edwin said, with a quietness that had a very specific kind of conviction in it. She looked at him. Good that you declined, he clarified, although I suspect I didn't need to say that. No, she said, but I appreciated it. The evening before Cora and her crew were due to start south, the town of Abilene had a small celebration in the Stockyard Saloon that was something between a business dinner and a social event. It was the kind of thing that happened at the end of the season, when the major herds had come through, and the deals were settled, and the money had flowed into town, and everyone was temporarily wealthy and temporarily friendly. Several of the major buyers and a few of the ranchers who had stayed in town were there. Cora was the only woman who was there in any capacity other than serving the drinks, which meant she was the only woman in the room standing with a glass in her own hand, which she found faintly amusing. She had changed from her working clothes into the one decent dress she had packed for the rare occasion of being somewhere with walls, a blue-gray thing that was practical enough for the West but presentable enough for company. She had put her hair up and it was staying mostly, and she was aware that she looked different enough from her daytime self that several of the men did not immediately recognize her as the same person who had stood in the stockyard that morning with her hat pushed back and dust on her collar. Edwin recognized her immediately. She saw it in the way he found her across the room the moment she entered, and held her eyes for a second longer than business required, and then came to where she was standing with two glasses and offered one before anyone else could reach her. "You look," he started, and then seemed to reconsider his first word choice, which she appreciated. "You look well rested," he said. "I look different without the hat and the cattle," she said dryly. "You look like yourself," he said, "just a different part of it." That was a more precise thing to say than she had expected, and she took the glass and let the sentence sit for a moment. The evening moved in the way of such evenings, with conversations that were partly social and partly the continuation of business conducted in a more relaxed register. Cora navigated it with the careful competence she had developed for rooms where everyone else was in a different category than she was, saying the right things and holding her ground without making enemies, and finding the pockets of genuine conversation wherever they appeared. Burton Hale was there, and he ignored her with the deliberate quality of a man making a statement with his body. She let him make it. Edwin did not ignore her. He found reasons to be in her part of the room repeatedly throughout the evening, in ways that she thought were probably not accidental, and that she did not discourage, because she was 26 years old and had spent 23 days on a cattle drive with 11 men, and a lot of very large animals, and the company of a man who was interesting and kind, and looked at her like she was a real person, was something she intended to enjoy for as long as she was in this town. They ended up, near the end of the evening, standing slightly apart from the main group on the long porch of the saloon, where the night air came in off the prairie cool and clean after the warm, smoke-thickened room. "Your hands are celebrating properly," Edwin observed, looking toward the other end of the street where the sound of fiddle music and boots on floorboards drifted out of the livelier establishment. "Rodrigo has the 2-drink limit enforced," Cora said, "but I told him 3 was acceptable tonight since the work is done." "And you, are you celebrating?" She considered the question. "This is celebrating," she said. "For me, the drink and the quiet and the end of something hard." "What's next for the ranch?" he asked, and it was a real question, the kind that wanted a real answer. "The breeding program," she said. "My father started crossing the longhorn stock with Durham bulls for better beef weight. I want to expand it. I've been studying the livestock reports from the Kansas City market, and the price differential for higher-grade beef is only going to grow. The railroads are changing everything. By 1880, you'll be able to ship dressed beef direct to the East Coast. The ranchers who have the right stock now will be ahead." He turned to look at her with an expression she was coming to know well, the one that said she had shown him a corner of herself he had not expected. "You've thought about this carefully." "It's my livelihood," she said. "Of course I have." "The investors in Kansas City," he said slowly, with the quality of a man thinking aloud rather than making a statement. "They're always looking for good breeding operations to partner with, stable supply agreements, the kind that would give a smaller ranch the capital to expand without taking on debt." She looked at him. "Are you making a business suggestion?" "I'm thinking out loud," he said. "I shouldn't be. It's after business hours." "I don't have business hours," Cora said. He smiled. The night air lifted a strand of her hair that had escaped its pins, and it crossed her face, and she lifted her hand to push it back. And in doing so, her fingers brushed the back of Edwin's hand where it rested on the porch railing. Just briefly, accidentally, the kind of thing that means nothing or means everything depending on the context. They were both still for a moment, and the fiddle music drifted over the rooftops, and the stars over Kansas were enormous and indifferent and beautiful. "I'd like to write to you," Edwin said, "about the business proposal when I've had time to think it through properly." She looked at him directly. "Is that all you'd like to write about?" A slow breath. "No," he said honestly, "it is not." Something settled in Cora's chest, warm and quiet like an ember taking hold. "Then write about the rest as well," she said. "I'll write back." She left early the next morning before sunrise because that was when the horses and the men were ready, and because the road was long and there was no reason to delay. She said a brief professional farewell to Edwin at the stockyard office, where he pressed her hand in both of his and held it for exactly 1 moment longer than was strictly formal. And she let him. And then she mounted her horse and turned south and did not allow herself to look back until they were past the edge of town. When she did look back, he was still standing in the street in front of the stockyard office, watching them go, and the morning light was very new and very gold across the Kansas plain. She turned back to the road and put her heels to her horse and rode south. The drive back was easier than the drive up. No cattle to manage, just horses and men and the long familiar landscape of the southern plains rolling past at a steady pace. Rodrigo rode beside her for the first morning and was quiet in a way that was not his natural quiet, which was the quiet of a man at peace, but the quiet of a man with something held. "Say it," Cora said. "I said nothing." "You're thinking very loudly, Rodrigo." He was quiet another moment. Then, "He is a good man." "He is a cattle buyer," Cora said. "He is a good man who is a cattle buyer," Rodrigo corrected gently. "Your father was a good man who was a rancher. Good men come in many occupations." Cora considered the horizon. "We have 200 miles between us," she said. "Letters cross 200 miles," Rodrigo said. "And then what? He's in Kansas, I'm in Texas." "People move," Rodrigo said, with the magnificent simplicity of a man who had seen enough of life to know that geography was not the hardest obstacle. "Or they do not move. But they should not let distance make their decisions for them before the heart has had its say." Cora looked at him. Rodrigo looked back with the expression of a man who has raised a person from childhood and considers honesty to be among the kindest things he can offer. "You are stepping far beyond your professional capacity," she said. "I am," he agreed cheerfully. "But you have no mother and no father and no one else who will say the obvious thing, so I say it." She smiled despite herself. "Thank you, Rodrigo." "Of course, Miss Keller." The ranch came back into view after 12 days on the road, and Cora felt the same thing she always felt at the sight of it, the particular relief that is not just tiredness finding its end but identity finding its foundation. The Keller Ranch was hers in every way that mattered, built of her father's vision and her own stubborn labor, mortgaged twice and paid back twice, now in better shape than it had been since before the drought of 1869. There was work to do. There was always work to do. She threw herself back into it with the focused energy of a woman who understood that a ranch does not wait for its owner to recover from an emotion. And by the end of the first week back, she had settled the winter feed supply, contracted for 3 new breeding bulls, and written a long, detailed letter to a Durham cattle operation in Missouri about the possibility of improving her breeding stock further. And she wrote to Edwin Bancroft. She wrote the letter 3 times before she was satisfied with it. The first version was too formal, reading like a contract. The second was too personal in a way that made her feel exposed in the direction of the paper as she wrote it, which told her it was the truest version but not quite the right thing to send. The third was a careful, honest thing. It discussed the breeding program and the ranch's direction, and asked his opinion on the Kansas City market developments he had mentioned. And at the end, with a directness she had decided she was done being afraid of, said simply that she had found their conversations in Abilene to be among the better parts of a long and challenging season, and that she hoped he would find time to write. His reply came 3 weeks later, longer than she expected and better written than she had allowed herself to hope. He answered every business question with the precision of a man who had been genuinely thinking about it. And at the end of the letter, in a hand that was slightly different from the careful business script of the beginning, slightly less controlled and slightly more human, he wrote that he had thought about their last evening on the porch more than was probably professionally appropriate, and that he had decided to be honest about it on the principle that she had told him she preferred honesty. She read that paragraph 4 times, and then folded the letter and put it in the wooden box in her bedroom, where she kept the things that mattered. The correspondence continued through the fall and into the winter. Edwin wrote about the Kansas City investors and the changing patterns of the cattle market and the political situation around the cattle towns, which was complicated by the ongoing presence of the Texas fever quarantine laws that made the drives increasingly contentious. Cora wrote about the ranch and the breeding program and the mathematics of running a profitable cattle operation in a changing market. And between and through all the practical material, running like an underground river, something else developed slowly, and with the careful intentionality of two people who were both used to building things properly rather than quickly. He visited in November. He sent a letter a month before asking if it would be appropriate, phrasing it as a desire to inspect a breeding operation that had made such an impression on him in Abilene. She wrote back saying that the ranch was always open to serious buyers, and that she would have Rodrigo set up the guest room in the main house. When his horse came up the long drive in the cool November morning, Cora was standing on the porch with her coffee, and she had not dressed up for the occasion, because she was not going to be a woman who put on a different face for company, but she had put up her hair, and she was wearing the blue-gray dress under a work coat because it was cold, and the dress was the warmest thing she owned that wasn't purely utilitarian. He looked different here than he had in Abilene. In Abilene, he had been the man behind the desk, the cattle buyer in the good wool jacket. Here, on horseback in the Texas morning with the hill country spread out behind him, he looked less like a man fitting into the role assigned to him and more like himself. "Miss Keller," he said, dismounting. "Mr. Bancroft," she said. "Welcome to the Keller Ranch." He looked around at the property with the clear and interested eye of a man who is seeing something and not just looking at it, taking in the fenced pastures and the solid construction of the outbuildings and the good order of everything. Then he looked at her with that directness she had come to know from the letters. "It's exactly as you described it," he said. "I described it accurately," she said. "I don't see any use in doing otherwise." "No," he agreed. "You don't." They stood for a moment in the cool Texas morning, and then she gestured him inside for coffee, and the conversation that had been running through their letters for 3 months continued seamlessly, as if no distance had ever intervened. The 4 days of his visit were the best 4 days Cora could remember in longer than she cared to think about, and not because anything dramatic happened but because of the quality of them. Edwin moved through the ranch with a genuine interest that was not performance, learning the operation with the same focused attention he had shown in the stockyard in Abilene. He rode out with her in the mornings to check the breeding herd, asked useful questions, offered observations from the market side that were genuinely helpful. He ate dinner at the ranch table with Rodrigo, and the hands with an easiness that Rodrigo, she noticed, approved of. In the evenings, they sat by the fire in the main house and talked, and the talking moved from practical to personal in the natural way of two people who have been honest with each other in letters, and discover that honesty translates to real rooms. On the third evening, with the fire burning low and the Texas night quiet outside the window, Edwin set down his coffee cup and said, "I have a proposal." Her heart did something that she told firmly to settle down. "A business proposal," he said, and then added with a faint smile, "to begin with." She raised an eyebrow. "Go on." "The Kansas City investors are interested in long-term supply agreements with quality breeding operations," he said. "The market for higher-grade beef is growing exactly the way you predicted. An operation like the Keller Ranch, with a solid breeding program and a proven drive record, is exactly the kind of stable supplier they want to partner with." She listened carefully. The partnership would provide capital for expanding the breeding stock, guaranteed purchase agreements at above-standard rates for certified quality cattle, and access to the rail shipping contracts that the investment group controls, he said. In return, the ranch commits to supply quotas and quality standards. "And what is your role in this?" she asked. "I've been offered a position as the investment group's Western operations manager," he said. "It would mean leaving Abilene. It would mean spending time traveling the supplier operations. It would mean being in Texas significantly more often than I am currently." The fire crackled. The night breathed outside. "And the other proposal you mentioned," she said, "the one that comes after the business proposal." He looked at her with steady gray-green eyes. "I think you know what it is," he said. "I think you've known for a while." "Say it anyway," she said, in a voice that was almost perfectly calm. "I prefer directness." Edwin Bancroft rose from his chair and crossed the 3 feet of hearthside space between them and came to stand in front of her where she sat, not in a way that was crowding or demanding, but in a way that was deliberate and clear, a man putting himself somewhere and meaning it. "I would very much like to know you better," he said, "in the kind of way that leads somewhere lasting. I'm aware that you are not a woman who wants to be managed or subsumed or overridden. I'm aware that this ranch and this work are yours and not incidental to you. I'm not asking you to change any of that." A slight pause. "I'm asking if there might be room in it for me." Cora Keller looked up at the man standing in the firelight and felt the careful armor she had worn for 2 years of being alone settle slightly on her shoulders, not removed but easier, as if it knew it was less necessary now. "There might be room," she said, "if you're patient with it." "I'm a very patient man," he said. "Good," she said. "Then sit down and I'll pour more coffee and we can discuss the investment proposal in detail, because there are several terms I intend to negotiate." He laughed, that real chest-deep laugh, and sat down, and Cora poured the coffee. And outside the Texas stars were everything they always were over this land that was hers, and something inside her was quietly, completely joyful. Edwin stayed 4 days and then rode back north to Kansas to settle the remainder of Gerald Harwick's accounts and arrange his own transition. The letters that followed were different now, warmer in register, with the particular intimacy of two people who have looked at each other across a fire-lit room and said something true. Rodrigo, who read nothing of the letters but read Cora's face after each one, began whistling while he worked, which was not his usual habit. The winter passed in the way of ranch winters, with its own demands and rhythms and the particular satisfaction of work that is tending toward something. Cora expanded the breeding program as she had planned, taking on 3 new Durham bulls and beginning the careful record-keeping that would allow her to track lineage and quality improvement systematically across the herd. She also, with some difficulty, negotiated a new credit arrangement with the San Antonio Bank, this time without any cosigner requirements, because the settlement receipt from the Abilene Drive was enough to make even cautious bankers take her seriously. In February, a letter arrived from Edwin that was longer than usual and contained, at its close, the most straightforwardly romantic paragraph she had ever received from anyone. She will not have recalled the exact words, because the memory of them was too close to be fully described. But the substance was that he had been thinking for some time about what a life built beside her might look like, and that he found the picture considerably more appealing than any other future he could construct, and he hoped she was not entirely opposed to the idea of him coming back to Texas in the spring with something more specific to ask her. She wrote back and said she was not opposed. She used very few more words than that, because she was Cora Keller and her economy with words was a form of truth. He came back in April, when the hill country was green and flowering, and the air smelled of cedar and rain. He came with a formal offer from the Kansas City Investment Group, which Cora reviewed with the careful scrutiny she applied to all contracts, annotating 3 terms and returning a counterproposal that Edwin accepted on behalf of the group, with the smooth competence of a man who had expected exactly this level of rigor. The partnership was signed within 2 days. And then, on the 4th evening of his visit, on the same porch where she had stood with her coffee the morning he first arrived at the ranch, with the Texas sunset making the hill country into something that looked like it ought to be in a painting, Edwin Bancroft asked Cora Keller to marry him. He had not bought a ring, because he was a man who paid attention, and he knew that Cora Keller was not a ring-first kind of woman. He had instead written out, in his careful hand on a single sheet of good paper, a set of terms that he presented with a straight face and enormous warmth. The terms specified, among other things, that the Keller Ranch would remain hers by name and deed, that no business decisions regarding the operation would be made without her full authority, that Rodrigo Vasquez's position was permanent at whatever salary Cora deemed appropriate, that Edwin would contribute his salary and savings to the joint household, but would not have managerial authority over the ranch operations, unless Cora specifically requested it, and that he intended to love her with the full seriousness he had brought to everything that mattered to him in his life, which had historically been considerable. At the bottom of the sheet in smaller writing, I am aware this is an unusual proposal. I believe you are an unusual woman, and I mean that in the best way there is to mean it. Cora read the document twice. She looked up at him in the late light. You wrote me a contract, she said. I thought you might find it more legible than poetry, he said. She laughed, and it came from the same deep place his laugh came from, the real kind. Then she said, Yes, Edwin, I'll marry you. He reached out and took her hand, and she let him, and the Texas evening was warm around them, and the cattle were moving in the far pasture below the slope of the hill, and the whole world felt, in that specific and unrepeatable moment, exactly like what it was supposed to be. They married in July 1874 in the small church in the nearby town of Fredericksburg, with Rodrigo as witness, and 3 of the ranch hands in their Sunday best filling the front pews, and looking simultaneously delighted and slightly awkward in the way of outdoor men indoors for a formal occasion. There was no large production because neither of them wanted one. There was a good dinner afterward at the ranch, prepared by the cook, a quiet Mexican woman named Señora Fuentes who had worked on the property for years and who cried happily through the entire meal. Edwin had moved his things to Texas the month before the wedding, having formally accepted the Western operations position and established that his base of operations would be the Keller Ranch. He was away several days a month visiting the other supplier operations the investment group worked with, which suited both of them well. Cora had her work and her independence and the full authority of her own operation, and Edwin had his own work and his own traveling, and when they were together, it was because they chose to be rather than because they had nowhere else to go. The first year of marriage was a revelation to Cora in several ways, the most significant of which was that being with Edwin was not the diminishment she had feared, had half expected from years of watching what marriage did to women's authority in the world around her. It was, instead, a kind of multiplication. Edwin was genuinely interested in her thinking about the ranch and the market and the breeding program. He brought his own knowledge and observations to the conversations, and she brought hers, and the result was better than either alone. And there was the other part of it, the part that had nothing to do with cattle or markets or contracts, the part that was the fire after dark and the mornings when the light came through the window across the pillow, and she did not have adequate language for that part, not because it was beyond language, but because it was hers, and she kept some things close. In the spring of 1875, the Keller Bancroft operation drove cattle to Abilene again. It was a larger herd this time, 940 head, with a higher percentage of the Durham Cross stock that was commanding the premium prices Edwin's investment group had predicted. The contract was a formal supply agreement rather than a spot sale, negotiated over the winter in several rounds of correspondence with the Kansas City investors, and the price per head was the best Cora had ever achieved. Edwin rode the drive with them for the last 3 days, having traveled up separately from his rounds of the other supplier operations, and met them near the Kansas line. He was no longer the man in the wool jacket behind the office desk. He had, over the past year, become someone who could handle a horse around cattle without embarrassing himself, who knew the signs of a healthy drive from an unhealthy one, who could talk to Rodrigo about pasture rotation in a way that Rodrigo actually found useful. He also, on the second morning of the last 3 days, quietly took a position beside Cora at the front of the herd without making anything of it, and rode there until they came into Abilene, and she was aware that it looked, to anyone watching, exactly like what it was, a partnership in every sense. When they arrived in Abilene and rode through the stockyard gates with the herd moving behind them in a great warm tide of sound and dust, Cora recognized the man standing at the gate as one of Burton Hale's associates. He watched the herd come in with an expression that was calculating and also, she thought, slightly unhappy, the expression of a man whose predictions have not been borne out. "Good season?" he asked. "Exceptional," Cora said pleasantly and kept riding. The settlement went smoothly. The rail loading was efficient. Rodrigo managed the hands with his usual calm authority, and Edwin managed the paperwork with his, and Cora moved between both spheres with the ease of a woman who understood how to inhabit the space between. Burton Hale's informal agreement among the Abilene buyers had, in the 2 years since that first confrontation in the stockyard office, begun to show the cracks that agreements built on convention rather than law always eventually show. 2 other buyers had stepped away from it in the face of good business being left on the table. The cattle business in Kansas was evolving rapidly, driven by the railroad expansion and the changing market demands that Edwin had predicted, and in that evolution, there was less room for gentlemen's arrangements based on who should and should not be permitted to conduct business. It was not that the world had become fair. Cora knew better than to expect that. There were still towns where a woman rancher would be turned away from a deal that a man would get automatically. There were still men who would paper over their discomfort with her existence by pretending to negotiate with Edwin and not with her, and she would correct them with the patient firmness of a woman who had decided this was not worth her anger, only her refusal to accept it. The injustice of it was real, and she named it to herself clearly. But she had found a way through it that preserved both her dignity and her business, and she had found a partner who stood beside her rather than in front of her, and she counted those things as the victories they were. In the fall of 1875, Rodrigo told her in his characteristic indirect way that he had met a widow in Fredericksburg named Dolers, a schoolteacher originally from Oaxaca, and that he was hoping Cora would not object if his personal circumstances changed somewhat. Cora told him she could not imagine a more welcome development, and that Dolers was welcome on the ranch any time, and she meant every word of it. Rodrigo married Dolers at Christmas, and Edwin was best man, and the winter celebration at the ranch was the largest the property had seen since Cora's father's time. In the spring of 1876, 2 things happened that felt together, like the world tipping gently into a new configuration. The first was that the Kansas City Investment Group, approved the expansion proposal Cora had spent most of the winter developing, which would allow the Keller operation to triple its breeding herd over the next 3 years and establish itself as one of the primary quality beef suppliers in the Western supply chain. It was the plan she had been working toward since her father died, and its approval felt like the completion of something he had started. The second was that she told Edwin, on a Tuesday morning in March when the spring rain was falling soft on the Texas hills, that they were going to have a child. He was quiet for a moment that she was not sure how to read, and then he crossed the room and took both her hands and looked at her with the particular expression she had learned to recognize as Edwin at his most unguarded, the face behind the careful professional competence, the man who had driven 400 miles from Ohio with nothing but his own ambition and turned it into something real. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Is everything?" "I'm fine," she said. "I'm very healthy." Senora Fuentes already knows, because she noticed before I did, and she's been putting extra things in my supper for a month. He laughed, and she laughed, and the rain came down outside, and the Texas hills were the new green of March, and everything was very fine. Their son was born in October 1876 in the main house of the Keller Ranch, attended by the doctor from Fredericksburg and Senora Fuentes, who managed the proceedings with the calm efficiency of a woman who had delivered half the children in the county at one point or another. Edwin was present throughout, which the doctor considered unnecessary and Cora considered non-negotiable, and when the child arrived and was placed in his father's arms, Edwin stood in the lamplight of the room they had made their own and looked at the small, red-faced, fierce-eyed person he was holding with an expression that Cora would remember for the rest of her life. They named him James Thomas Bancroft, James for Cora's father James Keller, Thomas for Edwin's oldest brother who had stayed in Ohio with the family farm, and to whom Edwin still wrote faithfully every month. James Thomas was, from his earliest days, a child who made his opinions clear. He nursed with determination, slept on his own schedule without reference to anyone else's preferences, and regarded the world around him with the steady, observant eyes of both his parents. Rodrigo, who had no children of his own, became devoted to him in a way that was touching to witness. The baby's first word was not, as Edwin privately hoped, anything intelligible. It was a sound that everyone present agreed was probably attempting to be Rodrigo's name. Life on the Keller Ranch settled into a rhythm that was different from what it had been, and completely what it was supposed to be. Cora ran the ranch operation with undiminished authority and focus. Edwin managed his investment group work from the ranch when he was home, took his regional travel trips when they were needed, and was fully present when he was there in a way that she had not known to hope for but was enormously grateful to have. Between them, the work was shared not equally in all things, because different expertise and different presence at different times meant that distribution shifted, but fairly, with the mutual respect of two people who had entered the arrangement with their eyes clear. James was 2 years old when the drive of 1878 happened, the drive that completed the first phase of the expansion plan and delivered 1,120 head to Abilene on the most favorable supply contract the Keller operation had ever signed. Cora rode at the front of that herd as she had ridden at the front of every herd, and the men who drove with her, including several new hands hired for the expanded operation, followed without question because her authority had never been in doubt on this land and this drive. Edwin met them in Abilene with the contracts ready and the rail arrangements made, and when the settlement was finalized and the numbers were tallied, the profit was enough to retire the last of the original bank debt and leave the Keller Ranch free and clear for the first time in its history. They celebrated that evening in the same stockyard saloon where, 5 years earlier, Cora had stood with a drink in her own hand as the only woman in the room in any professional capacity. She was the only woman in the room in a professional capacity again this evening, because the world was not fixed in the 2 years since James was born, or the 5 years since the first drive. But she was also Edwin Bancroft's wife, and the mother of a 2-year-old boy, and the owner of a free and clear ranch with the most successful breeding program in the hill country. And she stood in that room with her glass and her husband's hand at the small of her back, and felt something that was not quite triumph and not quite peace, but was made of elements of both. Burton Hale was there, older and somewhat reduced in the way of men whose certainties have been gradually disproven by the persistence of people they underestimated. He made eye contact with Cora across the room and then looked away, and she let him, because she had no need to make anything of it and she never had. They stayed in Abilene 3 days and then turned south again for home, and James was there on the porch when they rode up the drive, in Senora Fuentes's arms, craning toward the sound of horses with the determination of a 2-year-old who has been told his parents are coming back and has taken it upon himself to be the first to see them. Cora dismounted before the horse had fully stopped, because she was good enough on horseback to do that without injury, and crossed the yard and took her son from Senora Fuentes's arms, and he grabbed a fistful of her hair in both hands and said something emphatic that was partially a word and partially just joy. And she buried her face against his neck and held him and felt him solid and warm and entirely real. Edwin came up behind her and put his arms around them both, and she leaned back against him, just for a moment, before the practical requirements of horses that needed tending and gear that needed unpacking, and a household that had been missing its primary managers for 3 weeks reasserted themselves. The years that followed were full in the way of lives that are lived rather than endured. The breeding program achieved what Cora had planned, and the Keller stock became known in the regional market as a reliable indicator of quality, the kind that buyers requested by name. Edwin's investment group expanded its Western operations, and his role grew with it, though he had negotiated terms early on that kept him Texas-based and home more than away. James grew into a boy who was his father's son in methodical patience and his mother's in observant directness, and who had Rodrigo's particular quality of moving through the world without wasted motion. He was on a horse at 3, competent at 5, and at 7 was riding fence lines with Rodrigo and asking questions that Rodrigo answered with the same serious respect he extended to Cora, because Rodrigo believed that children who asked intelligent questions deserved intelligent answers. In 1882, when James was 5 and the ranch was in its strongest position since it had been founded, Edwin came home from a 3-week Western trip with a proposal of a different kind. He had been to California, visiting a ranching operation that the investment group was considering partnering with, and he had brought back with him a detailed proposal for a joint breeding program that would allow the Keller operation to access Pacific Coast market connections, alongside its existing Kansas City relationships. He laid the proposal out at the kitchen table after dinner while James was asleep and the house was quiet, and Cora read through it with the pen she always kept at hand for documents, and Edwin watched her with the patient attention he had been watching her with for 9 years. "There's a clause in Section 4, she said. "I know," he said. "I flagged it for your review. It's poorly drafted," she said. "It could be read to give the California operations investors veto authority over breeding decisions." "Yes," he said, "that's what I thought as well. It needs to be rewritten," she said. "I agreed to bring it back to you before accepting anything," he said. She looked up. "You told them you needed your wife's review." "I told them I needed my business partner's review," he said, "which is accurate. You are the operating partner on the ranch side. Your review is not optional." She held his gaze for a moment. "There are men on the California end who won't be comfortable with that," she said. "There are," he agreed. "I told them that as well." She looked back at the document. The firelight was warm, and outside the Texas night was quiet, and through the bedroom wall she could hear the small sounds of James sleeping in the easy, deep way of children who are completely safe. "Send them the revised clause," she said. If they accept it, we can discuss the partnership further. And if they don't, then they can find someone whose operation doesn't require the managing partner to have actual authority over her own breeding decisions, Cora said. Edwin smiled. After 9 years, the smile still changed his face in the way it had in that first stockyard office, making him look less like a man performing a role and more like himself. "I'll write the revision tonight," he said. "Good," she said. "And then come to bed, because I have a 5 o'clock check on the breeding pen, and I intend to sleep before it." "Yes, ma'am," he said, with a warmth that she knew by now held the whole of what they had built, and she went to bed, and he followed an hour later after finishing the letter, and the ranch was quiet around them. The California partnership with the revised clause was formalized in the spring of 1882, and it opened the Western markets exactly as the original proposal had suggested. By 1885, the Keller Ranch was supplying cattle to buyers in 4 states and had been cited in a livestock industry journal as an example of the new model of Western ranching. Scientifically managed breeding, systematic record keeping, market-informed production planning. The article referred to the operation as the Bancroft Keller Ranch, which Edwin corrected in a letter to the journal's editor, noting that the ranch was the Keller Ranch, had always been the Keller Ranch, and that his own contribution, while he hoped substantive, was not the source of the operation's name or its reputation. The journal printed his correction in the next issue. Rodrigo, who had dolers read him the letter when it arrived because his English reading was slower than his speaking, laughed for a very long time and then told Edwin, with the sincerity that was his highest register of compliment, that he was a good man. James turned 9 in October 1885, and his birthday gift was the horse he had been asking for since the spring. A young bay gelding he immediately named Captain with the unself-conscious confidence of a child who has no doubts about horse naming conventions. He took his first full ride on Captain the morning after his birthday, with Rodrigo beside him and Cora watching from the fence, and he handled the horse with a steady naturalness that made Rodrigo look over at Cora with an expression of satisfied recognition. Here was the next generation of this land. In 1886, when things were going well and the future of the Keller Ranch seemed as solid as it had ever been, Cora found herself facing a question she had not quite expected to face in this form. A letter from the Texas Livestock Association asking if she would be willing to serve on their advisory committee for breeding standards, a committee that had never previously included a woman, and was apparently being pushed toward including one by a small group of progressive members who had read the Livestock Journal article. She sat with the letter for 2 days before talking to Edwin about it, which was unusual, because she talked to Edwin about most things within the day. He noticed the sitting and waited because he had learned to read her silences well enough to know when she was working something out internally and when she needed him to ask. On the second day, she showed him the letter. He read it and handed it back. "What's stopping you?" he said. "The time," she said. "The committee meets quarterly in Austin. That's 3 days each way. 12 days a year I'm not on the ranch." "Rodrigo can manage 12 days a year," Edwin said. "Rodrigo could manage the ranch for a month without difficulty, and we both know it." "There are members of the association who won't want me there," she said. "There are," he agreed. "There are also members who wrote that letter, which means there are people in that association who do want you there. And the standards they're developing will affect every cattle operation in Texas, including this one." She looked at the letter again. "A woman has never served on this committee. A woman has never run a successful breeding program of this scale in Texas before either," Edwin said. "And you did that too." She folded the letter carefully. "James is 9, she said. "James is 9 and healthy and thoroughly capable of surviving 12 days a year without you, which I say as someone who will be here every one of those 12 days," Edwin said. "He will probably make a considerable fuss about the horse needing a new shoe or some such thing, and Rodrigo will handle it with his usual competence." A long pause. "You think I should accept?" "I think," Edwin said carefully, "that you have spent 15 years making the Keller Ranch into an operation that deserves to have a voice in the standards that govern this industry. I think the women who come after you in this work will find those doors slightly more open because you walked through them. I think that matters, even when it's inconvenient." He held her gaze. "And I think you know all of that and you're not actually uncertain about whether to accept. You're certain. You're just giving yourself time to be certain you're certain." She stared at him. "You know me too well," she said. 11 years, he said, "more or less." She wrote the acceptance letter that evening. The following spring she attended her first advisory committee meeting in Austin, and it was everything she had expected in terms of discomfort and somewhat more than she had expected in terms of opportunity. There were 8 men on the committee and Cora, and 3 of the 8 looked at her with the expression she knew, the settled certainty expression, and 4 looked at her with the careful neutrality of men who were withholding judgment and might be persuaded by competence. And one, a rancher from East Texas named Caleb Morrison, who ran one of the largest commercial operations in the state, stood up when she entered the room in the old-fashioned courtesy of his upbringing and said, "Miss Keller, I read the journal article. It's an honor." She revised her assumption about the distribution. The meeting was long and technical, and exactly the kind of work Cora understood in her bones. By the end of it, she had made 3 specific contributions to the discussion of grading standards that the committee chairman, however reluctantly, had to acknowledge were both correct and useful, because the data she cited came from her own operations records and was more comprehensive than anything else in the room. Caleb Morrison, on the way out, fell into step beside her. "You'll be back next quarter," he said. "I will," she said. "Good," he said simply and went to his horse. Edwin heard the whole account when she returned to the ranch 3 days later, sitting on the porch with their coffee in the long evening, with the cattle visible on the far slope and James's shouts from the pasture where he was putting Captain through paces audible in the distance. "The 3 who objected to your presence," Edwin said when she finished. "Did they argue against your contributions or just against your presence?" "One argued against a specific point I made," she said. "He was wrong, and I showed him why with the data. He did not like it, but he could not dispute it. And the others sat quiet," she said, "which I will take as provisional acceptance." "You'll convert them by the second meeting," Edwin said. "I don't need to convert them," she said. "I just need them not to obstruct the work." He looked at her with that expression she loved, the one that had started as complicated and had become, over 11 years, simply full. "How is it," he said, "that after all this time you still manage to say exactly the right thing?" "Practice," she said, "and low tolerance for anything other than the point." He reached across and covered her hand with his, and they sat like that while the evening came in over the hill country and James's shouts grew more purposeful, and then, after a while, quieter, as even the most energetic 9-year-old eventually comes to terms with the hour. The years continued. James grew. The ranch grew. The committee work continued, quarter by quarter, and by 1888 Cora had been elected to the committee's standards subcommittee chair, which was a first by every measure. Caleb Morrison seconded the nomination. 3 of the 8 original members voted against it, but the 4th man, who had been neutral, had become decidedly not neutral over 2 years of watching her work, and the motion carried. Edwin, when she told him, opened a bottle of the good whiskey he kept for particular occasions and poured 2 glasses and handed her one, and they drank it without ceremony on the porch, while the stars came out over Texas. And she thought about her father, who had believed in her before it was easy to believe in her, and felt his presence in the work she was doing as clearly as if he had been standing beside her. In 1889, Cora and Edwin's second child arrived, another boy they named Samuel, and he was as different from James as a person could be while being made of the same material. Where James was methodical and observant, Samuel was immediate and expressive, a child who felt everything at full volume and communicated most of it at once. He arrived in the world crying with what seemed like genuine outrage at the situation, and did not particularly moderate this approach over the following months. Senora Fuentes, who was now in her mid-60s and had officially retired to the role of household authority figure rather than active cook, declared Samuel an excellent baby on the grounds that you always knew where you stood with him. James, who was 12 at his brother's arrival, took to Samuel with a seriousness that made everyone around him feel soft. He would sit beside the baby for long periods, not doing anything in particular, just present in the way that Rodrigo sometimes was. The patient presence of someone who has decided this is where they are supposed to be. Edwin, watching his older son with the baby one afternoon, said quietly to Cora, "He's going to be the kind of man who people trust without knowing exactly why." "He learned from good examples," Cora said. Edwin looked at her. "You," she clarified, "and Rodrigo." "In that order," he said, and the teasing in it was fond. "Don't push it," she said, and he laughed. And the baby startled at the sound and then settled, and James looked up from his focused study of his brother with the particular expression of a 12-year-old who finds adults mildly baffling. The Keller Ranch celebrated its 25th year of operation in 1890, the same year Rodrigo finally gave in to Doller's long-standing opinion that a man of 67 did not need to be sleeping under the stars on cattle drives, and accepted the title of Ranch Manager Emeritus, which Cora invented specifically so that his dignity would be undisturbed, while his body got the rest it had been earning for 50 years of hard labor. He did not retire from the property. He did not retire from anything involving advice, which he continued to dispense with the same quietly authoritative precision. He simply did less of the riding and more of the watching, from the porch of the small house he and Dollars lived in on the ranch property, and his watching was worth more than most men's doing. The cattle drive of 1891 was James's first as a working hand, at 14, not leading it or managing it but riding it from first to last, doing the work, learning the road. Edwin rode it with them that year, all the way, and Cora led at the front of the herd as she had always led, and behind her the plain of Texas rolled out flat and golden under the big sky, and her son rode in the midsection of the drive learning the rhythms of the work, and her husband rode the right flank with the competence of a man who had made himself belong to this life over 20 years of choosing it, and the cattle moved in their ancient way, and the road was long, and she loved every mile of it. In Abilene, the cattle town had changed considerably from the wild settlement of 1873. The town had grown and settled, and the worst of its frontier violence had been tamed by law and time, and the simple economic gravity of a place that was becoming permanent rather than transitional. The stockyard offices were more substantial. The buyers were more professional. Several women had, in the years since Cora's first drive, conducted cattle business in Abilene without it being remarkable, which was the small incremental shift that she counted more valuable than any single contract. The settlement of the 1891 drive was handled by Edwin on the contract side and Cora on the herd side, in the now familiar division that was efficient rather than gendered, each doing the work they knew best. James watched the settlement meeting from the corner of the office with the intent face of a young person learning something they intend to use. When it was over and the bank draft was folded safely away, Cora turned to her son and said, "What did you observe?" He thought about it carefully, in the way she recognized as inheritance. The buyer offered below the contracted rate for 2 of the Durham Cross steers because he claimed they were underweight, James said. "But you had the weight records from this morning and they were within the contracted range. And you showed him the records. He accepted the contracted rate." James paused. He knew before you showed him that he was wrong. He was testing. "Testing what?" Cora said. "Whether you'd let it go to avoid the argument," James said. "And the lesson," she said. "Know your numbers," James said. "And don't let things go to avoid the argument when the numbers are yours." Cora looked at her son for a moment, this 14-year-old who had her eyes and Edwin's patience, and a Texas afternoon's worth of experience to his name. "Correct," she said. Now go find your father and tell him I'd like a coffee from the place on the corner before we start the loading." James went, with the quick-footed purpose of a young person who is very pleased with himself, and Cora watched him go with the feeling that she had been given something extraordinary to look after, and had, perhaps, not done too badly by it. By 1895, the Keller Ranch was not the same operation it had been in 1873, when Cora had ridden into Abilene with 800 head of longhorn and her father's name nowhere on the contract. It was larger, more complex, more profitable, and more influential in its industry, which was a kind of success that her father had dreamed of but that she had made real. It employed 16 full-time hands and 3 seasonal workers. It operated under a supply agreement with 2 of the largest beef purchasing operations in the Midwest. It had contributed to the Texas Livestock Association's breeding standards in ways that were referenced in industry publications by people who did not always know whose work they were citing. James Bancroft, who was 18 in October 1895, had begun taking a formal role in the ranch management, with the same methodical care he applied to everything. He was not his mother because no one was, but he was learning the work with a thoroughness that made Rodrigo, from his porch, look satisfied in the way of a man watching something come right that he planted a long time ago. Edwin was 52 and had reduced his travel to a minimum, having built the investment group's Western operations to a point where they ran reliably and needed less of his direct attention. He was at the ranch most of the time now, and the presence of him had become so woven into the fabric of the place that Cora could not have said where the ranch ended and Edwin began, which was not the loss of herself she had feared marriage might be but the opposite, the multiplication she had barely allowed herself to hope for. Samuel, 6 years old and magnificently opinionated, had decided that his primary ambition in life was to teach the horses tricks, which Rodrigo viewed with philosophical acceptance and Dolores viewed with fond alarm, and which James viewed with the resigned tolerance of an older sibling who has accepted the essential uncontrollability of the situation. On a warm October evening in 1895, Cora sat on the porch of the house that had been her father's and was now hers and Edwin's, watching the sun go down over the Texas hill country while the sounds of the ranch drifted up to her. James's voice from the breeding pen running through the evening check, Samuel's carrying argument with Rodrigo about the merits of something, the distant low sound of cattle settled for the night. Edwin came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat beside her, and she took her cup and they sat in the particular quiet of people who have been together long enough that silence between them is not empty but full. 22 years, she said. From the drive, he said. From the drive, she confirmed. I rode into Abilene in the summer of 1873 and put my name on a contract and the whole town held its breath. And now, he said. She looked out at the ranch, at the fields that were hers and the cattle that bore the Keller brand and the sky that was unchanged over all of it, big and indifferent and beautiful. Now the town can breathe, she said. I'm done waiting for permission. Edwin set down his coffee and turned to look at her in the long last light, and she looked back, and 22 years of choosing each other were in the look, and all the contracts signed and drives completed and arguments won and seasons survived. And James growing from a 2-year-old on Senora Fuentes's hip to a young man who walked the land like he belonged to it, and Samuel's inexhaustible voice in the yard below, and Rodrigo on his porch in the dusk, and the ranch free and clear and thriving, and the work that was never finished and the life that was never finished and all the good things she had made of both. You never needed permission, Edwin said softly. No, she said. But I needed someone to sign the contract anyway. He smiled, and the smile was the same as it had always been, the one that made him look like himself. I signed it, he said. You did, she agreed, and I have not regretted it for a single day. Below them, Samuel's argument with Rodrigo reached some kind of resolution, because the voices shifted from dispute to laughter, and James emerged from the breeding pen and crossed the yard with the steady, purposeful walk of a young man who has a place in the world and knows it. And the Texas evening was everything it always was, wide and warm and full of the particular grace of a life that had been built one honest decision at a time. Cora Keller Bancroft sat on her porch in the October of 1895 and watched her world, and it was entirely hers, and it was entirely good. The last thing she did before going inside that evening was pick up the letter that had arrived that afternoon from the Texas Livestock Association, confirming her reappointment to the Breeding Standards Committee for the fourth consecutive term, and she folded it neatly and set it on the desk inside to be answered in the morning, because the morning would come and there would be work, as there always was, and she was, as she had always been, ready for it. Inside, the lamp was burning warm, and Edwin was there, and the house that had been her father's dream and had become her own was full of the sounds and the warmth of a life that was completely, irreversibly, and joyfully real.